70? What do you think he knew? They called him to 70 resolutions. And what do you think he knew about himself that he made promises to himself, 70 of them, and determined and kept the pledge that he would recite them to himself every week of his life and at the end of every month and at the end of every year? What was he doing? I mean, to be really honest, some of you can barely get your flip-flops on and make it to the Saturday night service. And you wonder why you don't have any spiritual victory? What did Jonathan Edwards know? You'd think if you're that profound and that gifted and that godly, it might be a little easier. I'll tell you what he knew. He knew the severity of the battle going on in his own soul for his own sanctification. And he knew that he was his own worst enemy. In the year of 1984. And there was a flight. It was a flight of Avianca Airlines. A jet. It crashed in Spain. Flew, as far as we could tell, straight into a mountain. And of course, investigators studied the accident site, recovered the black box, and they made a discovery. The black box from the wreckage of that Boeing aircraft had contained in it a voice recorder which revealed the several minutes before the fatal impact. And the first thing that the investigators heard was a shrill, sort of computer-synthesized voice from the plane's automatic warning system, and it told the crew in English, they were a Spanish crew, it told the crew in English, pull up, pull up, pull up, pull up. And then, astoundingly, the voice of the pilot was heard, snapping back, shut up, gringo. And he switched the system off. In a matter of minutes, the plane smashed into the side of a mountain and everybody was instantly killed. As I read about that a number of years ago in connection with a book I was writing on the vanishing conscience, it struck me that that is in some ways a parable of the way modern people treat the warning system that God's put in their souls. God has given us some very, very gracious gifts. And one of them is conscience. And we hear about it. There are little phrases, guilty conscience, etc., that we often perhaps use or hear used. But I think the conscience is one of the least understood gifts that God has granted to us, one of the least understood areas of biblical teaching, and I want to draw your attention to it. Maybe to give you a parallel is a good place to begin. You also have another system in your body. It's called pain. It's very helpful. It is very helpful. It's a warning system. It's exactly what it is, and it's designed to tell you that something is wrong with you physically. And if you just continue to override that pain, you will do permanent damage to yourself. One of the most interesting diseases that I've ever read about is leprosy. I mean, I like you, grew up as a little kid hearing all about lepers, in the Old Testament, the New Testament, and how Jesus healed the lepers. And I remember hearing that lepers were people who had no ears and no noses and no fingers and no toes, and that leprosy eats away the perimeter of your body. I found out a lot later by doing some reading on it that leprosy doesn't eat anything. Leprosy is a nervous disease. A nervous system disease. It destroys your nerves, so you can't feel anything, so you rub off your nose, and you rub off your ears, and you rub off your fingers and toes because you cannot feel, you cannot sensitize the level of pressure, the degree of pressure that's being applied, and you literally start erasing yourself. You can thank the Lord that you can feel pain. That's a gift that God has given us to warn us when we are doing damage to our bodies. And conscience, like that, is the same kind of warning system that God has given to us to tell us when we're doing damage to our souls, when we're doing damage to the spiritual part of us. But just so you know, we're working up to something. In Romans chapter 2, it says, the Gentiles, verse 14, who do not have the law, do instinctively the things in the law, these not having the law are law to themselves, verse 15, in that they show the work of the law written in their hearts, and I don't want to get to this part, their conscience bearing witness. The conscience is a witness, and it has two functions. It either, according to that verse, in their thoughts, accuses or excuses. It either indicts you or it defends you. It either says this is good for you or this is bad for you. It is the most important warning system because it's dealing not with the outside but with the inside. To do anything to make conscience function less than perfectly is to engage in soul-destroying activity. The wisdom of our day wants to render the conscience ineffective. The enemy, the god of this age, who develops the system that surrounds us in the world, wants us to ignore conscience and misinform conscience. Conscience may be saying, pull up, pull up, pull up, while the culture is saying, shut up, gringo, and turning off the switch. It may be contemporary modern psychology that says man is basically good, and to have a guilty conscience is to fail to recognize the necessity you have for feeling good about yourself and having self-esteem. It may be just a reversal of all moral values. It may be the idea that guilt is toxic or whatever. But we live in a society that's trying to do two things, and I just want you to think about these two things. One, misinform conscience, and two, shut it off. There were two things happening in that airplane. One thing that was happening was radar was finding a mountain, right? Radar was sending out a bounce-back signal that was informing that warning system that there was a mountain. Radar was articulating reality. And then there was the responding warning system that told the pilot what to do in face of that reality. Only two things needed to happen to save the lives of those people. One, you had to know what was reality, and secondly, you had to accept the warning. Sanctification functions on those same two principles. Starts with knowing the truth. Your conscience has to be fully informed about the truth in order to properly warn you. False information telling you to pull up confuses everything. I'll give you an illustration. A couple of weeks ago, I happened to be on Larry King Live, and I know some of you seen me on there. And it's always really interesting. And what's interesting is what you don't see. What happens in between, between Deepak and me, and, which is really kind of funny. Deepak is a pantheist who is convinced that God is in all of us. Well, anyway, we were talking, and Dennis Prager was there. You know who Dennis Prager is? A Jewish commentator. And we're talking about convictions and religion. This was in between airtime. And Dennis Prager said to Larry King, well, what kind of a Jew are you? He said, well, I'm an agnostic, secular Jew. He said, well, so you're not a religious Jew? No, I'm not a religious Jew at all. I'm a secular Jew. But he said, I'll tell you this. I was raised in a very kosher Jewish family. And to this day, Now, this is Larry King, and he's in his 60s and he's gone through 7 wives and a whole world of experience. But from my childhood, he said this: if you gave me milk and meat in the same meal, I'd vomit. Wow. What would make him vomit? Because from the time he was a little kid, he was informed that violated the law of God. And that has so stuck in his mind that it triggers his conscience and makes him sick. You know, that's encouraging to me. If he still got that sensitive a conscience, if we could just get it the right information, it could function. The conscience is a critical part of our spiritual life. Jonathan Edwards was talking to himself. He was talking to his own conscience in all those resolutions when he went over them again and again and again. Didn't need a crowd. He didn't need somebody there. He didn't tape record it to be publicly broadcast. It wasn't even prayer. Are you ready for that? The conscience is the soul reflecting on itself. It is at the core of what distinguishes human beings from animals. No ape ever made a resolution. This is what it is to be self-conscious, self-aware, reflecting on ourselves. It is our own innate ability to understand what is right and what is wrong and to make determinations to do what is right and not what is wrong. When the conscience functions as it should, when it's violated, it produces shame, regret, guilt, fear, disgrace, anguish. Now, conventional wisdom would say, you better go see a counselor. I'm afraid some people in the evangelical world would say, if you have shame, regret, guilt, fear, disgrace, anguish, and depression, you better go see a Christian counselor. You can't allow yourself to be indicted like that. I mean, even if Isaiah in chapter 6 showed up and said, I'm a man of unclean lips, somebody might say to him, you need some counsel. You need some help. You got to think better of yourself. You're the best guy going. You're really not to blame. You got toxic parents, as one writer said. Or you took a pill, that's why you killed your grandparents, right? There's going to be a quasi-medical or psychological explanation for everything, but this does damage to sensibilities. And it's tantamount to saying to your conscience, shut up, gringo, flipping the switch.